Hey, we are in a mental health series titled Suffering. If you've been joining us over the last several weeks, this has been a huge series in the life of our churches. I know a lot of people not only connect with it, but have been challenged by it. We've heard the stories, and it's just been incredible to see what God has been doing in and through the life of our people. Now, for Mother's Day, we picked a doozy. I'm not gonna lie, we're gonna get there in a second. We're gonna address this very specifically. You're probably thinking your pastor's nuts, and trust me, I have thought about that 10 ways till Sunday, about today's message, because on Mother's Day today, believe it or not, we are preaching on trauma. We're gonna go there. And you might be thinking I'm crazy. You're right, I acknowledge that, but I also believe that God is gonna do something very beautiful and very wonderful through the life of our people here today. So I'm praying even on a Mother's Day with such a sensitive topic that God would work a wonder among our people today. A lot of you, when you think about this topic, you're very familiar with it because there's so many people sitting here, so many people watching online right now, where you go back to that event, you know what has happened, you've had an experience, or you've had a period of your life for quite some time where you've had the traumas, you've had the abuses, the trials, the pains, the heartaches, like you know about this subject. So you need to know that today I'm going to approach this subject very delicately. You know, a lot of us, when we think about trauma, we think about the event that is associated or what happened or the abuse that happened. That's what our mind goes to when we think about trauma. But trauma, technically speaking, is the response that happened to that event. Trauma is a response to deeply disturbing or distressing events. You know, a lot of us think of trauma as physical, and very much it can be like a physical injury or a physical abuse. But trauma is not just physical. It could also be spiritual, it could be emotional, it could be mental. This is why it's so important to be reminded that wounds that you can't see often hurt as much, if not more, than wounds that we can see. And not only that, but oftentimes those wounds that we can't see take a great deal more of time to actually heal from. Like I wish a mental, emotional, traumatic things that have happened to us, I wish they were things that like you could put in a cast. And 6 to 8 weeks later, that emotional wound, that trauma is mended, that we are good. 6 to 8 weeks, that's all we have to do is carry that, put an emotional cast on, and we will be fine. But we know that's not how that works. So many of us, we have been hurt deeply. We have deep wounds, horrible experiences, things that have been imprinted on our minds forever. And as Christians, we want to talk about this. As Christians, we want to be able to have open communication, to be able to say the things so that we can go through the process of healing through these times. And maybe, just maybe, as a follower of Jesus or just a human, maybe you've tried this before, maybe with a group of Christians. Maybe you got to the point you're like, I need to tell someone about this. I need to be able to open up. I need to be able to share this freely. And so you start doing it. Maybe you open up in a life group. Maybe you open up at a coffee meeting and you tell the thing. You say the thing out loud. You get about 10% of it out. And then all of a sudden, maybe if you're with a Christian, a well-intentioned, loving Christian looks at you before you could ever even get it all out and says something like this. You know what? I'm glad you're sharing this with me, but I need to remind you of a verse that we're just well aware of from Romans chapter 8:28. That says that we know in all things, I know you're going through this, but we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Church, I love this verse. This verse has so much promise, so much power, and I'm gonna get to this verse at the tail end of the message today. But the reality is, if you're trying to open up, and a Christian uses this verse almost like a cliche, this verse given at the wrong time might not only not be helpful, but more than likely it could be hurtful. If you're still going through it, like if you're still in shock, if you're still in denial, if you're still moody and you don't know how to handle the emotions that are wrapped around with the thing that you have gone through, if you're still feeling overwhelmed or anxiety is still hitting you, or you're still numb to the fact, or even though that what happened was not your fault, but even though something or someone else did that thing to you, you still feel guilt and shame in that moment, even though you had nothing to do with it. So today, I want to walk into this subject very humbly, delicately, and prayerfully, because I know how big of a thing this is for those that are sitting here. And so pray with me. Father God, I want to come before you. God, I need you. I need your help in this moment. God, convey your power through your word. Bring healing today. Be with us in this room. Be with us with the thing. God, let your spirit be the most important person in the room right now. Reveal yourself in a new way. And I pray this in your son Jesus' name. Amen. You know, depending on what generation you belong to, I think a lot of different generations approach this specific subject in a lot of different ways. Those that belong to the older generation, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when it came to this subject with these type of issues, a lot of the advice that you had been given as you were growing up, when it came to the traumatic events that happened in our lives, you almost got advice and counsel that sounded something like this. You know what? You just need to get over it. You know what? It couldn't have been that bad. Or not only that, maybe it was that bad, but compared to everybody else, like, can we just stop and admit just for a second that, yeah, what you went through was bad, but compared to other people on our planet, like, people have gone through worse things. So let's kind of just put this in perspective just for a second. Let's just try to put ourselves in the right mindset. Maybe you got that type of advice growing up. Or maybe one of my favorite sayings when it comes to physical or emotional abuse, maybe someone did one of these on you. Like, you know what? You just need to rub some dirt in it. You know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger type of advice. And the response people have gotten over the years when it comes to trauma is those type of things. But we need to realize when it comes to trauma, we can't just get over trauma. You actually have to heal from trauma. And so today, that is my goal. I'm hoping to build a foundation, not just a practical foundation, but also a biblical foundation and a strategy on how we could actually find healing. I actually think there are biblical steps that God has given us that in through our worst moments, periods of life, that God desires healing and restoration and hope in your life. And I actually think there's a biblical strategy on how we could implement that in our lives. But like last week, before we get there, we actually have to define the thing, right? We have to define it. In order to defeat something, you first have to define it. And so there are 3 different types of trauma that I think we just need to briefly define here this morning and what some of us have had to walk through in life. The first type of trauma is acute trauma. Acute trauma is the response from a one-time tragic event. And some of you guys, you like literally had to live through some of these one-time tragic events. Maybe it was the car accident that happened to you, and it was a bad car accident, not just physically, but also emotionally. Maybe you wound up in the hospital. Maybe that one-time event put you in a state where you had to recover for months, maybe even years on end after that time, and it was a tragic thing. Maybe it was you survived a natural disaster, like growing up in the Midwest, Indiana. Maybe you went through a tornado. Maybe you went through something, a natural disaster happened, and you had to walk through that. Maybe on moms, as you're thinking about Mother's Day, maybe you as a mother, maybe you had to go through a really complicated birth. And in that day, there came a time where it was kind of tragic because you kind of heard something that you started realizing that your life at that moment might be very much in danger, and you almost didn't make it through that. And maybe that one thing has stuck with you for years and years. Maybe you lost your business during COVID, and maybe that was the thing. Or maybe it was very severe. Maybe you had to live through something like being date raped in college. But it was a one-time event. It was horrible. And the response to that thing was tragic. The second type of trauma is referred to as chronic trauma. This is a long-term response from prolonged or repeated events. It wasn't just a one-time thing, but it was a long-term thing. Maybe it's something that happened over a long season in your life. And so maybe for you, the example was when you went through grade school, you were bullied all through grade school, and you have carried with that with you for years to come. Maybe you're someone that you not only experienced a time of racism in your life, but your whole entire life you've been dealing with racism. Maybe when you were younger, you were introduced to something that you should have never been introduced to. Maybe you were introduced to pornography at a young age, and that carried with it a very traumatic upbringing in your life. Maybe you were raised in a home where your parents were addicts, and so even though you went home every day, you never had one day in your life where you felt like home was a safe place to be. Maybe you were sexually abused, not just one time, but maybe multiple times. Odds are it was probably by the same person. The third type of trauma is referred to as complex trauma. This is the type of thing where you're raised in that home or you had been married to that one person. And it wasn't just one of the things, but it was actually a combination of probably everything that I've already talked about. There's a lot of type of abuses. There's chemical abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and the list can go on and on and on and on. And no matter what you have been through and at what level, if you're not familiar with this, trauma changes you. Changes your perspective. It could change how you think about God. It could change how you think about all of your relationships. It could change even how you think about all of your outlook on life, how you see people. And here's what I don't want you to do today. I don't want you to communicate to yourself what so many generations before us have communicating to us about these issues. I don't want you to tell yourself that it's no big deal, that compared to other people, it's not a big deal. Other people have gone through so much worse, and so put your things aside because it's not as big a deal as compared to what they are going through. No, trauma is trauma regardless of what other people have had to live through. If you've had something in your life, you need to know today that God desires, wants, longs, provided a way to bring healing to you, that the God of hope wants you to heal. You know, I want to look at a very, very familiar character in the scriptures. I want us to look at today the Apostle Paul, and I want us to look at him today possibly in a different way. Now, when I say the Apostle Paul, again, wildly familiar for those who are familiar with the scriptures. He's the guy that, you know, the greatest missionary to ever live, the guy that God called, the guy that gave us literally penned half of the New Testament. I'm talking about that guy. And I want us to see, as some of us already know, but maybe never have equated the Apostle Paul to this before, but I want us to see how the Apostle Paul endured acute, chronic, and complex trauma regularly in his life. And I want to show you, and I want you to see it. And then I want us to see what God did to bring healing in Paul's life, and not just healing, but literally to bring Paul into a stronger place. Make him not just a stronger Christian, not just his faith stronger, but make him a better man, make him a better follower of Jesus. You know, I think we need to start by talking about Paul's conversion to Christianity, because you can make a very, very easy case that his conversion was pretty traumatic. Like if you know the story, let's just say that to the least. His conversion was not like my conversion to Christianity. I came to Jesus Christ. It was a beautiful day. My pastor came up to me and he said, "I think you're ready." And I said, "You know what? I am ready to give my life to Jesus." And then we set up the time, we set up the date. My family, we went over to my pastor's house after church on a beautiful, sunny Southern California day. We got in this backyard. There were refreshments that were around and little, appetizers that you could eat. Then I was put into a jacuzzi that was probably like 90 some odd degrees. It was just a beautiful temperature. Like, it was a great way, right, to give your life to Jesus. That was not Paul's experience in giving his life to Jesus. Paul, before his conversion, was actually a guy by the name of Saul who persecuted Christians. And in Acts chapter 9, later on, if you go and read this story, in fact, Acts 9 is about the story of the history of the church. You also get all of Paul's story and his missionary journeys in the book of Acts. But in Acts chapter 9, you see that this guy named Saul, before Paul was Paul, he was this guy named Saul, and Saul was murdering Christians. And very specifically, it said a light came down from heaven and knocked him down. Now, this wasn't like the type of light, like, I don't know if you guys have been on your back porch between like 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the morning the last 2 nights, saw the northern lights. I actually missed it. I was totally asleep. I had no idea what was even going on, but I woke up, saw everybody's pictures. But I don't want you to think the light that came down from heaven, the northern lights, where you're just in awe and wonder, and you're looking up at heaven, you're like, praise be to God, how amazing is this? Like, I am seeing God in the most tranquil, wonderful way. No, it said that Paul was knocked down by a light that came from heaven. Now, I have no idea what that type of light is. I've heard other preachers preach that text before. And so what type of light knocks people down? I have no idea. Was he knocked down by a bolt of lightning? I don't know. But what I do know is that God got his attention. Very much so. Not only that, but all of a sudden he's knocked down from this powerful light. And then all of a sudden the voice of God, the voice of Jesus himself says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" So not only is he being knocked down, all of a sudden he's getting like a hellfire, brimstone type of message from Jesus himself, confronting him on all of his sins and everything that he's doing with the church. And then, if you know the story, it said that God literally took Saul's eyesight away from him for 3 days. For 3 days, no eyesight. And not only that, but he couldn't eat or drink for those 3 days. Now, we have the scriptures. We know how that story ends. We know that 3 days later, God is going to bring a restoration back to his sight. He's going to do something incredible. He's going to give him a new name and a new purpose. But do you know who didn't know that at the time? Saul. Saul didn't know what God was going to do. He probably thought he deserved all of this after his confrontation. But again, we know the rest of the story. We know 3 days later, Saul was healed and given a new name and a new purpose. And this Christian killer would turn into a killer Christian preacher by the grace of Jesus Christ. And the good news is, because Paul was willing to endure that type of event, that type of trauma, that type of get your attention thing. The good news is we know that God did things like, okay, because you're willing to do this, Paul, I'm gonna give you a 6-figure salary now, right? Or because you're willing to go through this, I'm gonna give you the benefits. I'm gonna give you the pension plan. I'm gonna give you a hot wife. Like all these things. Because he was willing to do these things, God was gonna say, I'm going to bestow all of these things, these blessings upon you. If you look at Paul's story, you're a pastor, I tell you. If you look at the story, that's not what happened to Paul. No, Paul, even after his conversion, even after God was going to turn him in to the greatest missionary ever, that greatest missionary ever for the rest of his life would have to endure prolific abuse. He would never have a home ever again. And he'd be kicked out of every place that he would go to. In fact, in the book of Acts, if you look at Paul's missionary journeys, there's actually 3 that he took. He took journeys from Jerusalem all the way to Rome. From Jerusalem, some scholars even say he could have made it as far as Spain. Now think about this. 2,000 years ago, there was no planes, no trains, no automobiles, okay? It was just caravans and walking and ships. And he did this over and over again. And not only that, but you would think, by the way, if God says, I want you to go to this city, and I want you to go to this town with this message, that God's blessings would be on you in such a way that that hedge of protection that we all pray for, that hedge of protection would be on him, and he would never have to fear for his physical safety. But if you look at the book of Acts, he was constantly being abused, ridiculed, persecuted, ran out of town. He had to run out of so many different towns because they were going to kill him. In Acts 9, he ran out of Damascus. In 13, he ran out of Antioch and Pisidia. In Acts 14, he ran out of Iconium and Lystra. In Acts 17, he had to run away from Thessalonica. In Acts 17, he had to run away from Berea. In Acts 18, he had to run away from Corinth. In Acts 21, he had to run away from Jerusalem. Why? Because he was a criminal? No, because he carried the gospel message of Jesus Christ and it ticked people off to the point where they wanted to kill him. And he endured ongoing severe trauma. And I personally believe that even through that, God brought healing to him in those situations. And so the question I have for all of us today is, how do we get that same type of healing? How do we do it? Let me give you 3 things here this morning. The first is this: we need to process the pain of our trauma. We need to process the pain of our trauma. This is so important. You see, in order to process something, you have to first acknowledge it. In order to process it, you have to acknowledge it. This is important because so many people for so long have kept the thing a secret for far too long. Some of you have ignored this issue for long, and if you ignore it, you will never heal from it. And you won't heal from it if you suppress it, and you won't heal from it if you just try to forget that thing. No, you start to heal when you take it to God and you process it. And for some, this acknowledging aspect, this might be very, very difficult because for some, you've bottled the thing down for so long that even very, very important people in your life don't know about this. Some of you have been married to a person for years, decades of your life, and you've never told them about the thing. And so in order to acknowledge it, you might have to have the most strange, most awkward, most difficult conversation of your life and say, hey, I know you've known me for a long time. I know you love me, but you need to know this. Maybe just not a spouse, maybe a parent, maybe a brother or sister, maybe a trusted friend. But I need to tell you, I've been abused. I've gone through this. I've gone through this trial. I've never told anybody, but I realize in order to find healing, this needs to take place in my life. Now, let me clarify something for all of us. And you might not really like how I say this, some might get in trouble, hopefully not. But there are some people today that think that everything is abuse. Just because someone disagrees with you, that doesn't mean that you were abused. Just because someone corrects you, someone disagrees with you on something different, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've been abused. But some of you, maybe for the first time in decades of your life, some of you need to acknowledge the thing. I was abused. I was abandoned. I was mistreated. And again, let me say this, walking into this very delicately, knowing what this subject is going to do in the minds of our people. Let me say that I acknowledge how difficult this is. I mean, gosh, how hard, how vulnerable, how scary. Some of you guys might have to open up a can of worms that you prayed would never, ever, ever, ever have to be open again in your life. But this is why this is so important. This is why we have to acknowledge this. You see, instead of seeking connection, we prioritize protection. Instead of taking our pain to trusted people, we often push trusted people away. But the reality is, we don't heal in isolation. We heal best in community. This is, by the way, why we push community groups so much here at LifeWell. We call them life groups. This is why one of our core values here at LifeWell is that you need the church. You need the church. But guess what? The church also needs you. While we might have a personal relationship with Jesus, that personal relationship was never, ever, ever, ever meant to be private. No, you were meant to be in a relationship with God and his people through the church. These iron sharpening iron type of relationships. But if you ignore the pain, the wound is still there. And if the wound is still there, then you will do what a lot of us have done in life. You see, if we don't face the thing, if we don't process and acknowledge the thing, we're just gonna bring other things into our life to help us cope, to try to bring healing. Those things that mask themselves as the healing agents, but the reality bring us down roads that we don't want to go. If we don't process it, we dive into possibly drugs or alcohol or sex. Or maybe there's so many people in this room that the reason you're a workaholic is because you would rather work yourself to death. You would rather totally monopolize your schedule with things and with tasks and with work. And you have done it for years so that you don't have to deal with the thing. Paul processed his pain. In fact, in a moment, I'm going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. If you want to open up your Bibles, you can turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 1. If not, the passages will be up on the screen behind me. You could download the Bible app. But before we get there, let me just kind of paraphrase a larger section of scriptures found in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23 through 28. Again, 2 Corinthians 11, 23 through 28, you could read in detail everything that Paul had to endure, all the trauma that he had to face. But literally, Paul, in depth, talks about what he had to do. He talks about how he went to prison probably more times than he was able to count. He talks about how he'd been beaten 5 times with the sentence of being beaten up to 39 times, 39 lashes. Now, really quick, if you've ever wondered why the Hebrew punishment was to be beaten 39 times was one short of a death sentence. But what was really interesting about the motive behind 39, the motive behind 39 wasn't necessarily for the person being beaten. No, the person could have died after 25, 30 lashes, 35 lashes. See, the reason they stopped at 39, because in the Hebrew culture, if you stop at 39 and someone dies, well, they died of their wounds. If you went beyond 39, well, then they died of murder. And so Paul was beaten 39 times, 5 different times in his life. He was beaten 3 times with rods. He was stoned. He was shipwrecked. He almost starved. He froze. He was in danger everywhere that he went. And this is what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. It says, "We don't want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we've experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure. Oh, don't worry. God would never give you more than what you could handle." Show me where that's in the scriptures. Far greater, beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Do you know if you've ever gotten to the point in your life because you've went through the thing or you're going through the thing, if you ever got to the point in your life where you just didn't even want to go on anymore? You need to know that the guy that wrote half the New Testament knows exactly how you feel. But notice what Paul did. Paul talked about it. He wrote about it. He processed it. So I want to encourage you to find the right place, the right people, process the pain of your trauma. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be in your whole life group, among 12 to 15 individuals. That might be very vulnerable and very crazy, depending on the circumstance to do if you're not connected with that group yet. But it might be 1 or 2 trusted individuals that you've developed a relationship with saying, you know what, I have something in my life. I need to get it out. I need to tell something. Would you be willing to do that? It might be making an appointment with one of our elders here at LifeWell, one of our pastors here at LifeWell. For some, it might be consulting with a trusted therapist. In fact, depending on the trauma, I encourage you, yes, to go and talk to that trusted person, whether that is a elder, someone in your life group, a pastor on the team here at Lifewell. But one of the things that we need to acknowledge as the trusted people, if someone ever comes to us and we are their trusted people, as trusted people, we need to understand our own limitations. And I don't know about you, but I've never been trained in trauma therapy before. I haven't. So maybe the best thing that we could do as those trusted people is walk through that thing with that individual, to be with them, to bring them meals, to lend them an ear. But maybe the best thing that we could do as one of their trusted people is to connect them with a trusted Christian therapist that could walk alongside them, that has training in helping them get from point A to point B and to find healing. But we can't ignore it. We have to acknowledge it. We process it with trusted people. The second thing we do is this. We prayerfully press into God with our trauma. We take it to God. We talk to God about it. And from a pastor's perspective, I don't think you need permission from your pastor. But if you need permission, go and complain about it to God. Get real with him. God is big enough. He can handle it. This is what Paul did in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Now, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, let me just give you a little context here really quick. Paul was complaining about a thorn that was in his side. Now, a lot of people have a lot of theories on what Paul's thorn might have been. Out of all the list of everything that he had to endure, pick one. Like I have no idea which thorn it was, but we know it was complex. We know it was traumatic. We know that it was ongoing, and we know that it was a thorn that was tormenting him. And I personally believe that all of us at one point in our life, whether it be a short thorn that only lasts for a little bit, one that falls for a season, or maybe that is prolonged a little bit longer, all of us are going to have some type of thorn that we're going to have to endure in our life. I really believe that. I think some of you might be sitting next to your thorn right now, right? That joke did not land. Okay, but don't elbow him back there. But all of us have things in our lives that we can't handle at times. And I want you to notice what Paul actually did in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 8. 2 Corinthians 12:8 says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. Now, it says 3 times that Paul pleaded with the Lord. I don't want you to think of these things as 3 prayers. Like prayer 1, pleaded with God. Prayer 2, pleaded with God. Prayer 3, and then he was done. No, I actually think when it says that Paul pleaded 3 different times, I actually think that these were 3 seasons of prayer in Paul's life. But notice that Paul didn't blame God for his thorn, but he took his thorn to God. He prayed, he pleaded, he begged. He even unloaded on God. Guys, you could take your thorn to God again and again and again and again and again. You could unload on God. You could give God your all. You could tell God, I just don't understand. Like, how could you allow something like this to happen? God, I thought you loved me. If you were a loving God would not allow me to walk through the things that I had to walk through. God, why didn't you show up? Why weren't you there? Why didn't you protect me? God, I thought I could trust you. So why did I have to walk through this thing? You can give that to God. You can unload on him. He could handle it. You could wrestle with God. In fact, one of the things that I really, really love about wrestling is that wrestling with God is a close contact sport. But you also probably need to know who's going to win that match. But God cares for you. Cast your cares on him because he cares for you. And notice how God responded to Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9 through 10. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness so that Christ's power may rest on me. And then Paul says something that, if taken out of any other context than this one, would be considered very, very, very weird for anybody to say. But this is what Paul says. Paul says, so that is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness and insult, in hardship and persecution and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Do you realize that is the context that Paul wrote that verse in? During torment and trauma and abuse that he was having to endure in his life? That only comes in the presence of God. You see, you take it to God. And by the way, if God doesn't take away the thing, doesn't bring healing immediately in your life, notice God's response. Look, my grace is sufficient. My grace is what you need first. I need you to understand the grace and the love that I have for you. Learn about it. Be consumed by it. Let the grace be the overarching theme in your life, because the reality is this. Nothing can change your past. Like, I wish there was a magical prayer, a prayer that we could say before God, and we could say, God, this thing, I want to give it to you. I want to acknowledge it. But then after this prayer, God, I just want you to go into my memory bank, and I want you to completely take the memory from me. Like, I want it gone. Like, I wish in some cases there were times where we could say a prayer and then the thing was just completely removed from our minds. But the reality is there's nothing that we can do to change our past. Nothing. It's happened. There's nothing we can do to change our past. But you need to know that God can, does, and wants to heal your broken heart. And maybe this is what you need to hear today. Maybe some of you thought that the preacher preaching on trauma on Mother's Day was his dumbest decision. And by the way, the jury's still out on that. I realize the gravity of this topic. But maybe this Mother's Day, maybe you needed healing. Maybe healing is the best gift you could receive today. Maybe the path of healing is why you're here. I want you to listen to the Lord's posture towards you today from Psalms chapter 34, verse 18, that reads, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted." He's close. And not only that, but he saves those that are crushed in spirit. Any of you there right now? We process pain with trusted people. We press into God. If we have to, we let him have it. We wrestle with God. Again, wrestling is a close contact sport. And maybe, just maybe, this will be the time in your life where you are closer to God than any other time that you've had with God in your life. And maybe, just maybe that's why God allowed you to live through it. Then the third reason, let me preface this with saying this. The third reason some of you might get upset by even me mentioning this or advising this, but you need to know, I'm not saying everybody is here yet. Let me point this out. Before we get to step 3, okay, you can't bypass step 1 and 2. You can't. You have to do step 1, step 2, then step 3. So you need to know, if you are not ready for step 3 today, you need to know that's not only okay, but what I would like you to do is I would like you to file this in for later, to put it on your mind, to put it on your list of the thing that God desires you to come to in your life eventually. But the third thing is this: we must pursue purpose in our trauma. Church, if it's too soon, then it's too soon. Again, my advice to you would be to file that away. But I believe God wants all of us to get to this point in our life when it comes to the healing of the things that we have had to live through. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3 through 4 reads this: "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us all in our troubles." Why? So that. Read those two words. So that. Why have you gone through these things? Why would a all-powerful, all-loving God, why would he allow us sometimes to have to go through these events? Why did I have to live through it? Why did I have to experience it? So that we can comfort those in any trouble with comfort we ourselves received from God. Church, you need to know that your pastor in a lot of ways knows what you're going through. In fact, if you're not okay today, you need to know that it is okay not to be okay. If you've never heard my testimony, I don't have too much time to elaborate on it today, but if you're not familiar with it, just to preface it, I have memories that will forever be imprinted on my mind, memories that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemies if I had enemies. I've had some things that I've had to process and I've had to battle with God. And you need to know, as your pastor, there's times in my life where I have let God know exactly what I think of him in the moment. I've had to wrestle with God. And I've also had to spend many years of my life finding forgiveness in my heart towards certain people. But you also need to know that I firmly believe that I have found healing. That by the grace of God, not only have I been healed, but I believe that I have come out stronger on the other side because of the power of the work of the Holy Spirit in the church in my life, that I believe that I am not the man standing before you today, and I wouldn't be the father standing before you, and I wouldn't be the husband standing before you, and I wouldn't be the pastor standing before you today unless God allowed me to walk through those things. To which is why I could say to you with compassion and not as a Christian cliche, and I want you to know it and I want you to feel it here this morning, Romans 8:28, that we know that in all things. Church, what do you think all encompasses? All. Even the trauma, even the thing, even the period of life that you've had to live through, even that moment that has been haunting you for so long, that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. You know, with your permission here this morning, let me press into you here just for a second as I'm concluding this message. There are some things about this topic that I think people fail to understand. First, let me clarify something about trauma. Your trauma may not have been your fault at all. In fact, maybe that's why you're here. Maybe you need to hear today that your trauma was not your fault. And it wasn't your fault. Your trauma was not your fault. Your trauma was not your fault. That might be the case for so many of you. Maybe it wasn't your fault. But if I could push into you a little bit here this morning, challenge you a little bit, while your trauma may not have been your fault at all, pursuing God for healing is your responsibility. It's your responsibility. You see, it's not necessarily that we get over the trauma. And it's certainly not saying that the trauma, the thing that has happened in the past was okay. No, some of you have had pure evil done to you in your life. But you need to know that your God desires, wants, has provided a way for you to heal from it. So pursue healing, church. One of the things that I talked about is